I want to give a quick shout out to Manta is here for recommending this tragedy. If you have any other suggestions, then please leave them in the comments. Also, don't forget to check out my true crime channel, Evil Among Us. There's a link in the description. Anyway, on with the video. To millions, football is considered the national game of England, and every weekend, hundreds of thousands of men, women and children travel up and down the country to watch their favourite teams in action. On the afternoon of Saturday the 15th of April, 1989, around 24,000 Liverpool supporters travelled to Hillsborough Football Stadium in Sheffield to see their team take on Nottingham Forest in this semi-final of the FA Cup. Just over 10,000 of these had tickets to standing areas in one side of the stadium, known as pens, an apt name given that they were bordered on one side by a 9-foot-high fence and barriers along the other. Due to the negligence of the police, 2,000 fans were allowed in all at once and followed a tunnel into two pens that were already overcrowded. This led to a crush, which resulted in the deaths of 97 people and 766 more were injured. The oldest victim was 67 years old, the youngest was just 10. The horror of this incident was not just the loss of life, but the cover-up by South Yorkshire Police, which began even whilst people were still being crushed to death. It was decided that the injured, dead and dying were going to be blamed for this disaster, and this lie continued for almost 30 years. The extent of the false narrative spread by the media and senior police officers and propagated by those in power, including the Prime Minister, is truly disgusting. Welcome to Tales of Tragedy. For today's tale, we go back 35 years to 1989 and travel to Sheffield, a city in South Yorkshire in the UK. There are two football stadiums in the city, Bramall Lane, which is home to Sheffield United, and Hillsborough, which since 1899 has been the home of Sheffield Wednesday. In 1989, Hillsborough had a capacity of 54,000 and had been selected by the Football Association as the venue where the semi-final of the FA Cup would be played. The FA Cup is an English domestic football trophy based on the knockout format. The semi-final, since 2008, has been played at Wembley, but before this year, it was hosted by any large ground in the UK. Hillsborough was felt as a suitable venue for the match between Liverpool FC, one of the biggest clubs in the UK for decades, and Nottingham Forest FC, who during the 1980s were another powerhouse of English football. Kick-off was scheduled for 3 p.m. on Saturday the 15th of April 1989. If you want to go straight to the timeline of that fateful day, then please skip to the next section. But, in order to understand the tragedy, it's necessary to lay out all of the failings and safety issues which culminated in the deaths of so many. So the ground today, an all-season modern stadium, is very different to what it looked like in the 1980s. Hillsborough, like many stadiums of the time, had two important features relevant to this disaster. Firstly, all standing areas of the ground, and secondly, high steel fences between the spectators and the pitch, which had been installed at most venues due to issues of hooliganism. Standing areas known as terraces were introduced due to demand. Tickets for this area could be sold at a lower price, allowing those with less disposable income to watch their team. However, it wasn't about the fans, it was about money. The space taken up by 100 seats could be occupied by around 180 people standing, so an extra 80 tickets at lower prices would actually work out as a greater profit overall. However, the true number of people who were allowed into the terraces at all grounds around the country was consistently far in excess of this ratio. At Hillsborough, there were several terraces, and one of these was located at the lower tier of the West Stand, known as the Leppings Lane End, due to the name of the road bordering it. The steel fence between the spectators and the pitch was 9 foot tall and angled inwards at the top, preventing climbing, and it could only be opened from the pitch side. These areas also had anti-crush barriers, which people could lean on, but which were actually designed to create some separation between supporters. However, some of these structures were 60 years old. As an ominous warning of what was to come, in 1981 there was a crush at the Leppings Lane End during an FA Cup semi-final match between Tottenham Hotspur and Wolverhampton Wanderers, where too many spectators were let into the terraces. There were no fatalities, but 38 fans were injured including suffering broken arms, legs, and ribs. As a response, lateral barriers were installed to restrict sideways movement in order to reduce the result of a crush from the swaying of fans. This resulted in the terrace being divided up into what became known as pens. Initially, there were 3 pens, but by the time of the tragedy, this had increased to 7. This invalidated the ground's safety certificate, and despite the space taken up by this lateral fencing and the gaps between the pens, clearly meaning less spectators could be in the terrace, the maximum capacity of the area was not adjusted, and so was regularly overcrowded. So now, if a crush did happen, spectators would have nowhere to go. They would have no way backwards or sideways, and would instead be forced forward into the steel fencing, or potentially trodden underfoot on the concrete floor. These areas were a tragedy waiting to happen. Lastly, with regards to issues related to the ground itself, there was a problem with the turnstiles. Prior to the 1981 crush, there was significant overcrowding at the turnstiles, with far more people trying to get into the ground than they could handle. This had not been changed, and in April 1989, despite 10,100 Liverpool fans having tickets for the terrace at the Leppings Lane end of Hillsborough, there were just 7 turnstiles for them to pass through. Each turnstile was reported to have been able to let a maximum of 750 people into the ground per hour. 7 would allow 5,200 people through during this time, so to get everyone in safely would take almost 2 hours. However, fans were told to get to their seats just 15 minutes before kick-off. After passing through the turnstiles, there were various entrances to the pens. Of relevance to the tragedy was a tunnel which filtered straight into the 2 central pens, pens 3 and 4, where the tragedy occurred. The location of this tunnel will be relevant for later. So you have a ground that was fundamentally unsafe, had inadequate turnstiles to get in, and the fans were herded into pens like cattle, where if something went wrong, they would have no escape. Compounding this was the command of an arrogant police officer with absolutely no experience of crowd control on this scale. Prior to the date of the Hillsborough disaster, policing at the ground had been the responsibility of Chief Superintendent Brian Mole. He had been responsible for every home game at the ground and had overseen the 1987 and 1988 FA Cup semi-finals, which had also been played at Hillsborough. Superintendent Mole was experienced and spoken of highly by his colleagues. He would drive around the area before the match, checking the local roads, looking at traffic and potential bottlenecks. He would also regularly patrol the area before and during the game, checking on crowd levels. It's likely that his intervention had stopped potential crushes in the past. However, in October 1988, a probationary PC in Mole's unit was handcuffed, stripped and photographed in a fake robbery by his colleagues as part of a hazing ritual. As a result of this, 4 officers resigned and 7 were disciplined. Superintendent Mole was transferred to a desk job, apparently as punishment for the way he handled the aftermath of this incident. Rather than allowing him to oversee the football match and then being transferred, command of the FA Cup semi-final was handed to newly promoted Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield on the 27th of March 1989, just over 2 weeks before the disaster. Duckenfield had no experience of crowd control at football matches of any scale. He was a deeply unpleasant and arrogant man, and, as his first meeting with those under his command, he spent the entire time puffing out his chest and remonstrating his subordinates who he'd only just met. One officer who was there later recalled that Duckenfield was, quote, very authoritarian and aggressive during the entire meeting. He also stated, it was a very one-way conversation with Mr. Duckenfield. He basically told us we were useless, we were no good, we were doing it all wrong, it was going to be his way. He was not a pleasant man. Importantly, this officer made a further comment about the character of Duckenfield, stating, quote, if he was given the opportunity to be, I believe he would be a bully and looking for scapegoats. He was so despised that some officers who'd been in the unit for years had made requests to transfer because they refused to work under him. And so, the foundations of the disaster were laid before a single fan had entered the ground, and on the 15th of April 1989, thousands of men, women and children arrived to enjoy an afternoon of football. Over 90 of them would never make it home. At around 2 p.m. on Saturday the 15th of April 1989, an hour before the 3 p.m. kickoff, issues were starting to become evident outside Hillsborough Football Stadium. CCTV cameras captured a bottleneck forming around the entrance to the Leppings Lane End turnstiles. This was due not only to the fact that there were not enough turnstiles for the fans who had tickets to get into that section of the ground, but there were many people who were in the wrong place, and due to the crowd behind them, they were unable to get out of the way, causing more obstructions, leading to further delays. By 2:30, half an hour before kick-off, less than half of the 10,100 ticket holders for this area of the ground had managed to gain access, and there was now a bottleneck of around 5,000 people forming. Rather than being on the ground and coordinating his forces, Superintendent David Duckenfield was observing everything from the police control room, essentially hiding. He consulted with another officer about delaying the start of the game to allow people time to get into the ground. Duckenfield decided against this. By 2:45, just over 5,000 people had gone through the turnstiles, with over 4,000 still waiting to gain entry. The crowd was massed by the turnstiles, but also a large exit gate, known as Gate C, which was only supposed to be opened at the end of the game. At around 2:52 p.m, Duckenfield gave the command to open the exit gate, apparently to relieve the pressure outside. This led to approximately 2,000 people flooding into the ground over the next 5 minutes. Directly opposite the gate was the tunnel to pens 3 and 4, and people naturally went towards this entrance. At the tunnel were usually stewards, to direct people to other pens if the central tube were full, but on this date there was no one. There were also no police officers directing people. The fans simply all surged forward. There was space in other pens, but people were eager to get into the ground quickly, as it was only a few minutes before kick-off, and also they wanted to get the best view, and so they went through the closest entrance. By 2:57 p.m, both pens 3 and 4 were dangerously overcrowded. Both areas had a safe capacity of 678 people, but there were between 1,200 and 1,500 fans in both pens, and people were already starting to get crushed and injured. At this time, cameras picked up the first spectators climbing over the fencing to escape the crush. In response, police officers forcibly pushed fans back into the pens, and despite pleas to open the gates in the fences, their cries were ignored. These pictures can never capture the full horror of what was going on, as by this point, people were already becoming seriously injured, whilst others were already dead or dying. It's important to identify what the cause of death was for almost every single person who died at Hillsborough. It was due to what is known as compressive asphyxia. This is where you're unable to breathe because of external pressure on the body. This was not just due to people being crushed against the barriers and trampled underfoot, but also because of the sheer number of people packed into the pens. Some people were crushed while standing up. It's been likened to being killed by being squeezed to death by a boa constrictor. Can you imagine the horror these people went through, the fear as they struggled to breathe? One fan who survived described hearing his ribs cracking due to the pressure of those around him before losing consciousness and waking up sometime later, injured but alive on the pitch. Another survivor recalled seeing a young woman pressed up against the barrier. She was purple, her eyes were bulging from her head, and her tongue was hanging out. She was clearly already dead. Despite the horror unfolding, the match actually kicked off at 2:59 p.m, with people still climbing over the barriers. At 3:04 p.m, a Liverpool player hit the crossbar of the goal, causing the crowd to surge forward, and at this point, one of the anti-crush barriers in Pen 3 gave way, and this led to people falling forward, crushing those at the front. It was likely at this point that the majority of the injuries and deaths occurred. More and more people were captured scrambling over the fences, trying to escape with their lives. At 3:06 p.m, a police officer ran onto the pitch and told the referee to stop the game, and the teams were ushered into their dressing rooms. At this point, the full scale of the horror was clear. Supporters in the upper tiers grabbed hold of those below and pulled them to safety, and police now finally opened the barrier gates and ushered people onto the pitch. There were not enough stretchers, so supporters ripped up advertising hoardings to carry the injured, dying, and the dead. At 3:14 p.m, a single ambulance drove onto the pitch. One of the two attending paramedics later recalled, quote, There were bodies all over the place, and people helping, people staggering. It was just complete chaos. However, they were criticised for not updating the ambulance control room of the situation and requesting more assistance. People were expecting more ambulances to quickly follow, but there was nothing. In the immediate aftermath, this was the response: one ambulance. It transpired that the police had called the ambulance service at 3:08 p.m, asking for a, quote, fleet of ambulances, but because they'd not heard from the paramedics at the scene and the words major incident or catastrophe had not been used, they dithered. It was only at 3:13 p.m. they decided to declare an emergency, and it was a further 17 minutes until the ambulance service's major incident ambulance was deployed. It didn't arrive at the scene until 3:55 p.m, almost an hour after the crush had started. It needs to be pointed out that the initial police call did not come from Superintendent Duckenfield. He was apparently making calls to get police dogs on site and not ambulances. By the time the ambulance arrived, dozens of people were already dead and hundreds more were injured. In total, 766 people were injured, many of them seriously. On the day of the disaster, 94 men, women and children died. The majority of them were in Pen 3. On the 19th of April, 4 days later, the death toll rose to 95 when a 14-year-old boy called Lee Nichol was taken off life support in hospital. On the 3rd of March 1993, a 22-year-old man called Tony Bland died after being in a coma for almost 4 years due to suffering catastrophic brain injuries at Hillsborough. Lastly, in July 2021, 55-year-old Andrew Devine died. He'd suffered irreversible brain damage at Hillsborough 32 years before. The coroner ruled that his death was as a direct result of the injuries he suffered 3 decades earlier. He became the 97th victim of this terrible tragedy. The dead included men, women and children, with the youngest victim being just 10 years old and the oldest being 67. 2 sisters, 3 pairs of brothers, and a father and son were amongst those who died. In addition, 2 men who were about to become first-time fathers lost their lives and never got to see their child enter the world. There are so many tales of horror from that day, but I want to play a news story about the deaths of sisters Vicky and Sarah Hicks, who were at the ground with their father and mother, Trevor and Jenny Hicks.
They are the last images of a family together, outside the Leppings Lane stand at Hillsborough. We see Victoria Hicks come through the turnstiles, followed by her sister, Sarah. They're with their dad, Trevor. Mum, Jenny, has just gone to her seat in a different part of the stadium. Victoria was 15, Vicky to her family. Described as football mad, she wrote her own match reports and planned to be a sports journalist. Sarah was 19, a grade A student who went to Liverpool University after turning down a place at Oxford. For the girls' parents, a day in court they prepared for, but that was always going to be difficult.
Today's it's about our girls, and so we've got a lot more facts to deal with. We spent lots of days, 24 hours, 24/7 I should say, wading through all the information that's come to light that we didn't have last time.
Footage was shown to the jury of the girls on the terraces. They'd become separated from their dad after he'd gone to buy a programme. Other images from minutes later are too distressing for us to broadcast. One witness described climbing a fence to try to pull Sarah free. Brian Doyle said, "I grabbed hold of her hand and tried to pull her up, but it was impossible. I just couldn't do anything. She was too tightly packed in. It was awful. I lost my grip on her and wasn't able to get hold of her again. She was crying and sobbing. Her face was total terror." Today, through their lawyer here, Trevor and Jenny Hicks passed their thanks on to another witness, Paul Taylor. He described finding Vicky lying on the floor with her arms outstretched. He tried the kiss of life, but said he realised she was dead. So he covered her face with her cardigan because he didn't want to leave her the way she was. Other pictures played in court showed Vicky being moved across the terraces before she was taken onto the pitch and into an ambulance. 2 individual stories, 2 victims of Hillsborough, as these inquests try to plot the movements and the final moments of all 96 who died.
The 97 victims of Hillsborough should never be forgotten. Ever. Regardless of what team you support, these were ordinary people who left their homes for a day out, never to return, leaving devastated families behind them. However, these families and those who died have been given no peace and have had to contend with over 30 years of lies and disgusting press coverage, as well as those responsible for this tragedy never suffering any consequences for their actions. The cover-up began immediately, and the scale of it is truly appalling and extended all the way to 10 Downing Street. I'll summarise the most horrific elements of the attempts to blame the dead and the injured for the disaster, but please bear in mind, this is not everything. At a later inquest, it transpired that a meeting of senior officers was held by South Yorkshire Police in secret immediately after the disaster, led by Chief Superintendent Terry Wayne. At the meeting he said they were, quote, going to put the blame on this disaster where it belongs, on the drunken, ticketless Liverpool fans. There's also a direction to follow the route taken by the Liverpool supporters on the way to the ground and photograph empty beer cans to solidify the narrative that the Liverpool fans were drunk. This was refuted by witnesses who stated that while some people were intoxicated, as is always the case at sporting events, this was the minority and had nothing to do with the disaster. The bodies of those killed were alcohol tested and their names run through the National Police computer to check whether they had a record, so they could be pointed to as being responsible, despite the fact that they were no longer alive to defend themselves. In addition, 164 witness statements have been altered. Of these statements, 116 were amended to remove or change negative comments about South Yorkshire Police. Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield was neck deep in the cover-up. He lied and claimed that instead of him ordering the opening of Gate C, which led to the influx of fans, it had been forced open. Police officers leaked false claims to a Sheffield-based news agency, which then provided this information to the Sun newspaper. On the 19th of April 1985, just 4 days after the tragedy, the Sun ran a front page with the banner headline, "The Truth." It then proceeded to claim that some fans pickpocketed the dead and dying, urinated on police officers, and attacked those performing CPR. The paper also made continued claims about the Liverpool supporters being drunk and acting like animals. There was even a ridiculous claim that some of them had told a police officer they'd had sex with a dead female victim. This is 4 days after the tragedy. 4 days. The same day as the 95th victim, a 14-year-old boy lost his fight for life in hospital. Things became even worse when it later transpired that the original planned headline was "New Scum," before the decision was made to change it. This headline caused absolute disgust to the people of Liverpool, which has continued to the present day. Very few places in the whole city sell the Sun newspaper, and the paper and its reporters are still despised. This is absolutely understandable. The Sun has always been the gutter press, but even by their standards, this was inhuman. Immediately after the disaster, Lord Justice Taylor was appointed to conduct an inquiry into the events. His report, known as the Taylor Report, was published in 1990 and concluded that, quote, the main reason for the disaster was the failure of police control. It also cited the decision to open the secondary gate as being a critical mistake, as well as the decision to not delay kick-off. It did not condone the narrative that the fans were in any way at fault, and in fact stated that they were, quote, not drunk, nor even the worse for drink. The Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, was told by the police immediately after the tragedy that it was due to, quote, drunken fans. She was then made aware of the findings of the Taylor Report, but she refused to condemn the police and instead wanted to focus on the report's recommendations for the future. Her chief spokesman, Bernard Ingham, refused to accept the findings of the report and is noted as saying in private, quote, there would have been no Hillsborough disaster if tanked-up yobs had not turned up in very large numbers to try to force their way into the ground. I visited Hillsborough the day after the disaster, and I know what I learnt there. So the findings of the report were buried. Despite the Taylor Report putting the blame squarely on the police, an inquest in March 1991 concluded that the cause of death of those who lost their lives was accidental. The families were devastated. They fully expected a verdict of unlawful killing, with a recommendation that manslaughter charges be laid against those responsible. In 1987, there was a further review of the tragedy by Lord Justice Stuart Smith, who sickeningly, during a meeting with the families of the bereaved, made a joke. He said, quote, "Have you got a few of your people, or are they like the Liverpool fans, turn up at the last minute?" He decided there was no need for a new inquiry. Finally, in 2009, the Hillsborough Independent Panel was commissioned, and its final report, published in 2012, outlined everything: the real cause of the disaster, the police cover-up, the staggering level of corruption. It totally vindicated the Liverpool fans of any wrongdoing. It would be another 4 years until a coroner ruled that those killed at Hillsborough were unlawfully killed, and it would not be until 2019, 30 years after the tragedy, that David Duckenfield was in the dock, having been charged with manslaughter by gross negligence of 95 Liverpool fans. He had been suspended from the police in 1989 and retired in 1991, and had been receiving a pension of around £23,000 a year ever since. Astonishingly, after his trial at Preston Crown Court, he was found not guilty of all charges and left the dock a free man. He has never shown any remorse for his role in the Hillsborough disaster. Other officers faced criminal charges, including related to falsifying witness statements, but not a single one was convicted. The Hillsborough disaster led to significant changes in English football, including elimination of fenced standing terraces in favour of all-seater stadiums in the top 2 tiers of English football, with this being implemented by 1993. However, as we pass the 35th anniversary of this tragedy, which claimed the lives of 97 people, the families who have fought so hard for justice have still been denied. This case is not only tragic, but absolutely disgusting. Thank you for watching. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.